I'm Sarah Kugelman. I'm a proud graduate of the class of 1989. So I'm here for my 35th reunion. And I am very pleased to present today's session, which is Mindmasters, the data-driven science of decoding human behavior. And our speaker today is Professor Sandra Matz-Cerf, and she is the David W. Zalaznick Associate Professor in the Business Management Division. And she takes a big data approach to studying human behavior in a variety of business-related domains. She combines methodologies from psychology and computer science, including machine learning, experimental designs, online surveys, and field studies, to explore the relationships between people's psychological characteristics, for example, their personality, and the digital footprints they leave with every step they take in the digital environment, such as their Facebook likes or their credit card transactions, etc. She was named one of the Data IQ's 100 most influential people in data-driven marketing in 2015 and 2016, and was recognized as one of the 30 top thinkers by the Pacific Standard magazine. So I would now like to hand the floor over to Professor Matz-Cerf.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Let me just quickly pull this up. It's so nice to be here. I just realized that most of you will have actually started your journey with us in Uris Hall. So I joined CB. I know. It's not one of the most popular buildings. I started in 2017, so I started in Uris Hall, and it's really nice to have classrooms that actually have windows here. So for those of you who've taken a tour, it's definitely been a bit of an upgrade, but it's a real pleasure to be here. So I decided to take you on a whirlwind tour through some of the research that I've been doing over the last really 10 years, ever since I joined CBS. And you'll see that my background is in psychology, but I was very interested in computational methods. So what is it that we can learn about people, their decisions, their preferences, the choices that they make, not by giving them self-report questionnaires, but really looking at their data. And I want to start this journey that we have together in like the next 40 minutes in this tiny village here. So this is Vögesheim in the very southwest corner of Germany. This is where I grew up. Population 500, at least when I was living there, my parents loved to remind me that by now it's 1,000 people, which, like living in New York, I have to say, doesn't make a huge difference. And my experience growing up there was really characterized by my neighbors knowing pretty much everything about me, right? So they knew who I was dating, they knew what I was doing in school, they knew my plans for traveling the world after, and they also did what neighbors do best, which is interfering with your life, right? And on some level, that was actually incredibly helpful, right? So like the fact that people knew me allowed them to actually give advice that was valuable. They told me, here's what you might want to consider doing after school. They connected me with internships. But also, at times, it was really annoying, right? Because they interfered with my life in ways that I didn't want them to do, and also behind the scenes without me having any control. Now, fast forward, I moved to New York. The contrast couldn't be much bigger. But one of the things that I learned, so if you think of this as my experience growing up in the village, right, everybody observing me, what I realized is that a lot of the work that I've been doing at the intersection of psychology, computer science, and business is really just taking what happened in this like really small analog village to what I think of as the digital village of the world, right? Because if you think of my neighbors observing what I was doing every day, every minute, this is really now what's happening with all of the data traces that we leave, right? Every time that we interact with technology, whether that's what we post on social media, that's whenever you swipe your credit card, that's very much the smartphones that you carry in your pockets 24/7, right? They know where you are at any given point in time. They know who you're in contact with. So all of these traces combined, in a way, do the same thing as my village community was doing. They try to understand, well, who's the person behind the data? And then, as I'm going to show you, that insight into someone's psychology, into who someone is based on their data, also gives people who collect the data a lot of power over their behavior, right? So it's not just understanding the person behind the data, but it's also potentially interfering with their lives. So this is a concept that I've been studying again for the last 10 years, which I call psychological targeting. And the way that I define is like the process of influencing people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors based on their predicted psychological characteristics. That's a mouthful. And for all of the computer nerds in this room, the way that I really think about this is that essentially what computers can do is they can read and write. So reading is, give me your data, and I can read your mind, I can read your psychology in these data points. And then the second part is the writing part. It's like once I understand who you are, I can also write into your mind, I can change your attitudes, I can change your feelings, and ultimately I can change your behavior. So if that sounds familiar, it's probably because you're familiar with this story here. It started in a Swiss outlet, Das Magazin, but then very quickly spread all over the world in 2016, the story of Cambridge Analytica. Now I should say, because I got my PhD at the University of Cambridge on the topic of psychological targeting, I get mixed up with Cambridge Analytica all the time. And not surprisingly, so fair enough. And I was actually involved in the story in the sense that I helped the journalists break the story. So I never worked for Cambridge Analytica, but when they first tried to figure out what the company actually did, they reached out to some of the scientists who had done research in that space. So I really tried to help them understand really the topic that I'm here to talk about today is like, what does the science say, right? Don't take the word of a PR company of whether they swayed the 2016 presidential election, but what do we actually know about how this stuff works? And the way that I've structured this for this talk today is like 3 big questions that I think are helpful to think through as we think through this topic. How does it work, right? Like how do you actually get from someone's online behavior to something that is much more intimate, like their psychological profiles? Then the big question, which has really driven a lot of the research that I've been doing in the last few years, is so what? Once I understand who's on the other side, what power does that give me over the behavior of that individual? And then lastly, what now, right? And assuming that there's now companies, third parties, who can access your data, influence your behavior, how should we be dealing with this, both as individuals, businesses, and then also, I would say, it's society at large. Okay, it's going to be a whirlwind tour. I speak relatively fast, so I'm going to try and keep you entertained. If at any point you feel like I'm speeding up too much or you're lost, raise your hand. I'm not going to pick on you. I'm just going to slow down. Okay, so like as psychologists, really what we're interested in, and I should say I'm a personality psychologist by training. So what we're interested in is like how do people differ from one another in terms of relatively stable tendencies when it comes to the way that we think, feel, and behave. And one of the models, and there's different models out there, but one of the big models that you oftentimes hear about in the media that was used by Cambridge Analytica, for example, is what we call the Big Five, or the Ocean model, given the acronym. And the way that we think about personality is essentially these underlying, relatively pragmatic dimensions that influence, again, how people think, feel, and behave. You have openness, which distinguishes between people who are more intellectually curious. It's probably this entire room here, like more artistic, more outgoing, and people who are more conventional, down to earth. Then you have conscientiousness, which is oftentimes referred to as the German trait, so people who are organized, reliable, dependable. I should say, having grown up in Germany, it doesn't apply to everyone, sadly. Extroversion, that's the one that I think we oftentimes use in everyday language. So people who love social interactions, they're full of energy, and they just seek out stimulation all the time, versus people who are more content just with their own company. Then you have agreeableness, which is the social trait, so how caring, trusting, and empathetic are you, versus more critical and competitive. And neuroticism, which is really how do you deal with your emotions. And the reason why I throw them up here is that in a second I'm going to show you a whole bunch of examples of how what we do online directly relates to some of these psychological traits. So again, stay tuned. I'm going to come back to how this is relevant in the context of data. Now, the big question for psychologists and business is really how do you measure these things, right? Assuming that you want to understand who's on the other side, that could be consumers, that could be employees, like how do you actually measure some of these traits? And the traditional one, which I'm sure that you're all familiar with in one way or another, is you give people self-report questionnaires, right? So that could be in a recruiting context, you take a survey, you have statements like, I talked to a lot of different people at parties, and then we ask you for your agreement. If you say, I strongly agree, we say, oh, that person is probably more extroverted. If you say you strongly disagree, you're probably more introverted. Now, or you've taken one of these Game of Thrones character quizzes on Facebook. So it's either or, either professional context or Facebook. But you can already tell, right, that there's a bunch of issues with some of these questionnaires. They work relatively nicely in context of science, right, where we can sit people down for 20 minutes, they complete all of the questions, they don't necessarily have an incentive to tell us something that is not true about themselves. But in the context of business, first of all, people lie, right? If I throw up the statement, I make a mess of things, and I ask you for your agreement in the context of a job interview, you might not tick the box, I strongly disagree, because you probably have a sense of what I want to hear. And it's also not scalable, right? If you think about this notion that I mentioned earlier, it's like it's not just reading, it's also writing, it's trying to influence behavior. I can't ask consumers to sit down for 20 minutes, complete a questionnaire before I show them the most appropriate and personalized ad on Facebook. So there needs to be a way that is, in a way, automated and much more scalable. And this has been a development that's happened over the last, I would say, a little bit more than 10 years, which is this shift away from these self-report surveys, or at least complementing these self-report surveys with something that is much more data-driven. So instead of asking you, hey, are you the life of the party, I could just observe whether you go out a lot, whether you meet a lot of people, right? Because you leave all of these data traces day to day. So here's some examples, and all of these predictions, as you can imagine, now you're gonna get the bullshit bingo. It's driven by machine learning, it's driven by AI, all of the keywords that you can throw out there, but I don't want to talk about any of the technical details. I really want to show you some examples that I think are really powerful in kind of opening the black box and showing you what someone does online directly relates to who they are as a person. So this is research that was done pretty early on Facebook status updates. So this stuff that you post about yourself, right? You talk about having had like this amazing avocado toast, like a matcha latte. I'm going to talk about Facebook likes, but that also generalizes to Twitter and other social media. But what you see here is that, again, extroverts, people who are outgoing and social, they talk about weekends, party, girls, amazing. So they're having a blast. Now, imagine the world of computer scientists that I typically hang out with. Looks very different. So you have, and again, what I love about these word clouds is it's not rocket science, right? So the only thing that we do here is we count words, and then we calculate simple correlations. That's all we're doing here. And you can see those two pictures emerge, right? It's the extroverts that are doing all of these social activities, and the introverts talk about all of the stuff that you don't need other people for. You don't need other people to read books and to work on your computer. Here's probably one of my favorites. So this is the personality trait of agreeableness. So agreeableness, again, is a social trait. People high in agreeableness, they're trusting, they're caring, they're empathetic, and you see it in this warm glow that this word cloud has, right? It's like blessed, amazing, Thanksgiving, wonderful. So there's just a bunch of people who are generally grateful about life. Word of warning, the people who are more critical and competitive don't have exactly the same feel to it. And you can sort yourself, by the way. I'll let you do that job. But what I love about this is that we're not cherry picking. So it's not that we went into the data and we said, hey, let's kind of come up with like a funny word cloud of swear words. And it also doesn't mean that if you're disagreeable that you swear all the time. It's a correlation, right? So it means that the probability of you being somewhat critical and competitive, given that you swear on Facebook, just goes up. So again, not rocket science. It's really just looking at how do people talk and what do they talk about. You can do the same thing with Facebook pages and Facebook pages that people follow, and that's going to become relevant in a second when I talk about the applications. So those are pages, for example, that are followed most often by extroverts and introverts. And again, it has like the same feel. So extroverts is all of the social things, introverts stuff that you do by yourself. Here's one that I think is really telling, so neuroticism. Again, how do you regulate your emotions? Neurotic people are all over the place, which I love, because sometimes they're so happy, right? But then also they hate themselves sometimes. And Kurt Cobain, also not the most bright and happy character. And then if you look at the stable side, which I think is really interesting, right? You have something like business administration, you just have to get through. But then you also have skydiving and parkour, and I think that's just driven by the fact that if you're extremely neurotic, jumping out of an airplane is just simply not that much fun, right? So you have to be somewhat emotionally stable to say, yeah, I do want to jump. So you see that. Here's some of the research that I should say is pretty controversial, both in terms of implications and in terms of how the science is done. But there's quite a bit of research now looking at pictures and videos, right? So it's one thing, the stuff that you type into your social and like how you talk about yourself, what they're looking at is essentially the pictures that people post and the inference that you can make from that. And one of the things that I like here, so what you see here is essentially the AI dreaming. Like it's the 10 most extroverted, predicted to be extroverted faces, the 10 most predicted to be introverted faces, and you can see that there's like a pretty remarkable difference that, and again, if you think about personality psychology, makes a lot of sense. So you have introverts. First of all, you can see the outline of glasses, because they read more. And you can also see extroverts, they probably care about their appearance a bit more, right? So extroverts, there's no genetic reason for why the hair should be blonder or why the eyes should be bluer. So they're probably dyeing their hair, they're probably wearing contact lenses more often. They're also smiling more, and they've also figured out that taking pictures from above just makes you look better than taking pictures from below. So extroverts, you can't see the nostrils. They just do the duck face, right? And introverts, they're like, doesn't matter. So again, I think it's super interesting that even like, oftentimes we don't think about this stuff, right? We just go out and we're not necessarily thinking about that. I'm just gonna put myself out there, and yet you can still make pretty intimate predictions. So the last time I've checked, you can leave your phone at home, you don't have to post on social media, but your face is something that is being tracked whether you want it or not. Okay, now the big question is, how accurate are some of these predictions that we can make, right? If I can get access to, in this case, what I'm showing you is only your Facebook likes. So you can imagine that the accuracy by which we can predict your personality is gonna go up even more if I have access to more data sources. But the question is like, how accurately can we predict these traits based on your Facebook likes alone? And I could throw a number at you and say, well, the correlation between your self-reported personality scores and the predictions is a 0.5. And then you're like, that doesn't mean much. Is that good? Is that bad? So what one of my colleagues did, which I think was a genius idea, is she actually said, why don't we compare the accuracy of the computer to the accuracy of other people in our environment? So let's just kind of have a race between the computer making a prediction of how extroverted or open-minded you are, and then let's ask other people. So let's ask work colleagues, let's ask friends, and family members and spouses to complete the questionnaire on my behalf, and then see if the computer is better, or people in our environment who should actually know us pretty well. And here's what she found. So what she found is the computer only needs about 10 likes to be better than work colleagues, needs about 65 likes to be better than friends, 120 to be better than family members, and about 300 should be better than spouses. Now, back in the day when she did this study, the average number of Facebook likes that someone was connected to was 230, which means the computer back in 2015 already won against pretty much everybody, right? And like family members, that includes siblings, that includes kids, that includes parents. So those are people who should know us pretty well. And again, extrapolating to now, we have better models and we also have a lot more data. So not unlikely that these models by now would also outperform the spouse, which doesn't mean that the models are perfect, but it means that they're pretty accurate. And one of the recent developments, so you can't give a talk on this topic without mentioning generative AI, ChatGPT, it's just has to come up. But the reason for why I think this is actually interesting in this context is that you now, back in the day, so when I started, essentially you had to train what we call a supervised machine learning model, where I give you someone's self-reports, I have access to all of their data, and now I explicitly tell a model, well, try to figure out how someone's data is related to the output. And for that, I both need the data set to start with, and I also need to be able to train these models. Now, one of the things that we know, and this is recent research that I've done with one of my grad students, is that just using ChatGPT, if I pop all of my social media posts into ChatGPT and ask it, well, what do you think is the personality of someone who posted these things to social media? It's doing actually a pretty remarkable job. It's almost as accurate as some of these more sophisticated supervised machine learning models that we trained. One of the interesting things is that it doesn't have to be static, right? So far I've just talked about the data that someone has generated historically, but you can have like an interactive interface. This is now chat. At some point we might just be talking, actually right now we might just be talking to our phones, and that means that the model that's sitting behind a chatbot like this can actually figure out, well, what are the things that I don't know yet, right? Maybe I don't know really if they're more extroverted or introverted, so let me ask some pointed questions to increase my confidence. And you see that using these chatbots, you actually bump up accuracy above and beyond everything that we've had before. And it also means that anyone can do it, right? So you can be an undergrad sitting in your dorm and run all of these personality predictions for whoever you can get your hands on of their data. Okay, so the so what question, and I'm going to come to that, is that good or bad, in just a second, so stay tuned. Because fascinating for a behavioral scientist, right? But I also know that it's a little bit terrifying as a citizen and user. So the so what question, and this was really the question that I was perhaps the most interested in when I started doing this research. And really what it boils down to is that once you understand who's on the other side, once you understand someone's psychology, that gives you a lot of power to influence their behavior, right? Because I understand your needs, your motivations, your aspirations. I can directly tap into those needs, personalize my approach, personalize the recommendations that they make, personalize the way that I communicate with you to get you to move in the direction that I want you to move in. And on some level, it actually mirrors, I think, what we've been doing for centuries, right? Any type of communication in the offline world is personalized. You don't talk to your 3-year-old nephew the same way that you talk to your girlfriend or the same way that you talk to your boss. It's so natural to us that we adjust what we talk about and how do we talk that we oftentimes don't even think about this. And I think what we're seeing now is just we're kind of moving this offline dynamic to an online world that was anonymous for a very long time and now suddenly becomes very much personalized and personalized at scale. Okay, so this was some of the earliest work that we did in this context, trying to highlight that understanding who someone is based on their data actually gives us a lot of power in terms of changing behavior. So here's a screenshot from the Facebook advertising platform. So we did this in the context of marketing. We teamed up with a beauty retailer in the UK, and their goal was to essentially get women to click on the ad, go to the website, and buy something. They were agnostic to what people bought. It was just kind of go to the website and buy something. And you can't target people explicitly based on personality on Google or Facebook, right? So they don't have this functionality, not because they don't know how to do it. Facebook actually filed a patent of personality prediction in 2015, way before Cambridge Analytica. So the fact that they seem surprised that all of this happened, I don't know, because they have their own patent. But they don't allow it at the moment. However, what you can still do is they allow you to target people based on interests. And now what I showed you earlier is that essentially there's certain interests that are associated with the personality trait of extroversion, and there's certain interests that are associated with the personality trait of introversion. And now, by mere association, by telling Facebook, hey, I want my ads to be only sent out to people who are connected to at least one of these likes, I can define an audience that is more extroverted than the average person, probabilistically, and an audience that's more introverted. Now, what I should say is that it's an incredibly crude way of targeting, right? It's not that we take someone's history, we make a prediction, and we say, well, this person is an extrovert or an introvert. I'm sure that there were like a lot of misunderstood introverts in the extroverted audience and vice versa. So very crude, but it allows us to separate these personality traits in terms of our audience, at least on some level. Then what we did is we collaborated with a beauty retailer. So that was the creative team that came up with 5 different ads for extroversion, 5 different ads for introversion. And you can see they really tap into these motivations and preferences, right? So extroverts, there was always something happening. It was a lot of people. The copy would say something like, dance like no one's watching, but they totally are. So that's playing with the need of extroverts to be the center of attention. And then you have introverts is always like much more reserved and quiet. And what we did was a super simple 2x2. So we sent both our extroverted and introverts to extroverted and introverted audiences. And the assumption was essentially if there was a match, so introverts getting introverted messages, extroverts getting extroverted messages, that they would buy more often. And that's exactly what we found. And in a way, so when I saw the results, I was actually surprised by how big the effect was. Because, again, the targeting was incredibly crude. So just like 2 different audiences based on one Facebook like at the time. And also, we didn't customize the entire journey, right? So once someone clicked on the ad, they were taken to the website, and the website looked exactly the same for everybody. So a pretty substantial effect that made, I think, all of us kind of stop and think for a second of like how much power this potentially has. Okay, now again, coming back to generative AI and how is that changing? Back in the day when we worked with a beauty retailer, we actually had to have a creative team sit down, come up with the ads. That's one of the reasons for why we didn't customize the entire journey, right? So they were already complaining about how many creative versions we needed. Now, obviously, generative AI is changing that, and it's changing it in a quite dramatic way and at ever-increasing pace. So one of the things, and you don't have to read everything here, but this was a study that we did recently where we just told ChatGPT, well, just write a short ad for a weekend getaway to Rome that's tailored to a person who scores high on the big big 5 personality trait of openness, without telling it much, right? So we just give it the label of a person who scores high on openness. We don't say, how is a person who scores high on openness characterized? How do they think, feel, and behave? We just give it that trait, and it does a pretty remarkable job. So it kind of taps into intellectual curiosity, into aesthetics, and the ads for like some of the other traits look really different. And again, what we show in this case is that people, first of all, think that these messages are more persuasive when they're customized, and they're also willing to, at least in self-reported intentions, say that they would be willing to spend more on going on these trips. Now, this is kind of cutesy because it's just kind of generative AI and ChatGPT can come up with this text. I think this is going to change fundamentally in the next couple of years, and I'm just going to go show you one clip. Some of you might have seen this. So this is a movie trailer for a James Bond movie that was never made and will never be made. It was entirely created by generative AI. So the script was written by generative AI. All of the visuals that you see are done by generative AI. And you see that this jump from, well, I can just produce text that is written in a certain voice, to I can come up with an entire visual that people can't distinguish from the real world. I think that's really where we're heading next. So it's so cool that I just have to show it to you. Let's see if I can. Oh, no, but you need the sound. Let's see. Oh.
We are not like the others.
Let me see. Well, you just have to imagine now explosions and like the typical James Bond movie. It's not muted, so I don't know what's happening here. It's okay. Oh, thank you to the tech team.
That the world is too small. For both of us.
And again, these actors never played in any of the James Bond movies.
Hello, James Bond.
What makes you think this is my first time? I just want to remind you. That I never miss.
I think it's just incredible. As you can find this on YouTube, right? So again, going from this, well, I can create some text that's written in a certain voice, to creating an entire movie of a trailer that people can't distinguish. You can imagine what your experience is going to look like. I could just tell the generative AI, well, create me a movie that's written in a certain voice, maybe based on someone's experience. So I think this is like a whole new ballpark. You also see this in business context. So this is Reid Hoffman, founder of LinkedIn, who created this virtual doppelganger, this digital doppelganger of himself. And it's hilarious because he's essentially interviewing his doppelganger. And again, the LLM, or the language model, creates the content of what his doppelganger is responding. And also the visual is very appealing. So again, fun thing to look at. And also really a pointer of like where this is going in the very near future. Okay, so one of the questions, do we really need psychology for personalization? Here my point, no, right? Amazon doesn't necessarily need to rely on personality traits. They can just look at what has someone bought in the past to make predictions about the future. But it can be helpful, and mostly because right now there's a lot of collaboration going on between machines and humans, right? So it's like we try to understand someone online, then there's oftentimes a creative team who gets involved to try and come up with designs, with ideas. And for that to happen, you really need the AI to explain what you're trying to do, right? So an AI can work with a million dimensions to characterize who you are. We humans can't. So there needs to be some interaction between the AI trying to explain, here's why I think this person might be interested in this product, and now you go take it from here, which is even more true if you think about this combination of offline and online, right? So online, a machine might know you based on, like, again, these 1,000 millions dimensions. But then the moment that you step into a store, this always annoys me in the hospitality industry, by the way. So like you have one personalized experience online, and it's probably pretty good. And then you step into the store, and you also have a personalized experience, but it has nothing to do with the online world, right? So ideally, you want to have like this holistic experience that's very consistent between online and offline. And the only way to do that, as long as humans are involved in the process at some point, is to make it such that we can actually understand it. Okay, is this a good thing or a bad thing? I think this is like one of the obvious questions. And this is the favorite scientific answer for everything, is like, it just depends. But the obvious one is the negative side, right? So manipulation, the loss of privacy. So there's like someone has like an insight that's very intimate into who we are without us ever having given permission to do so. And the second part of that, I think, is really this loss of self-determination and agency. So it's not just that you're losing your privacy, you're really losing your ability to make your own choices, right? So if someone can pull the strings behind your back and say, here's what you're gonna buy, here's potentially who you're gonna vote for, that takes away a lot of this agency and self-determination. However, and this is something that I actually really care about, is that I think there's a lot of positive use cases that arrive from the same idea of like, well, the same way in the village, right? The people could help me because they understood what I was interested in, how I was ticking, and so on. And so here's just like a couple of examples, right? You could imagine this being implemented in the context of education. How do you make education more effective and more personal, more entertaining? Just two quick examples, because I want to make sure that we have enough time for the Q&A. So some of the work that we've done in my lab is essentially looking at the flip side of spending. So I showed you I can get women to spend more by just tapping into their psychology. We've done the same thing with saving. So it's like one of the tasks that people struggle with, right? So we all know that we should be saving more, but it's really hard because you have to give up something in the now for something potential in the future. And here we applied the same principle. So we just kind of told people, like, imagine if you put some money to the side right now, you can do all of these fun, you can, as an extrovert, you can invite your friends to all of these social gatherings and so on. As an introvert, you can make your home more comfortable. And what we were working here with was a population that has less than $100 in savings. So again, that population is incredibly vulnerable because the moment that your car breaks down, you're done, right? You can't get to work, you're gonna lose your job, and that's the end of it. And what we did here is we managed to increase the percentage of people who managed to save $100 over the course of 4 weeks, which for them is like doubling their savings by a substantial amount. Again, not perfect, but it helps people not just kind of do the things that you want them to do, but also follow through with their own intentions. And then the other one is, which I think is a really big space, is the mental health space. And there's a couple of things that you can do with this technology, right? First of all, you can track. So you can try to diagnose and see, well, someone, and we oftentimes using smartphone sensing, so you see that someone doesn't leave their house as much anymore, there's much less interactions with other people, so they're taking fewer calls, they're making fewer calls. All of them might be nothing, but it could be an indication that someone is slipping into a depressive episode, right? And it's not a perfect diagnosis. It's not that we necessarily have to intervene, but we could just flag it and say, hey, again, might be nothing, but why don't you check and see if you might wanna get some additional help. And then again, the help itself can also be personalized. I think there's this very upsetting statistic that I think for every 100,000 people who are trying to get support and therapy, there's 13 therapists worldwide, right? So there's a huge gap between the need that people, the help that people need and the supply that we can actually afford. Okay, and this is really in a way only the beginning. So everything that I've talked about was relying on social media data, on these relatively static notions of who we are. What we know is that and the big five, right? What we know is that pretty much anything that we can try to predict about people's psychology from pretty much any type of digital footprints actually works. Again, sometimes with higher levels of accuracy than others, but we can make a very good prediction about pretty much everything you're trying to do. And it's also becoming a lot more dynamic. So this is the election of the Pope in 2005, election of the Pope in 2013. And you can see the pretty big difference, right? So we have these devices that capture pretty much everything we do. We capture the most important moments, kind of interact with people. And Louis C.K. really nicely captured this trend in a little skit that I'm going to show you here. Hopefully the sound.
Constant. Nobody takes in life unless it comes through this.
Yes.
Like whenever I see a televised event that's a huge, like the Olympics opening ceremony or a Times Square at midnight on New Year's Eve, everybody, they see seas of people all looking at it through their phone. Yeah. Like there's explosions and acrobats, but they're looking at it through a little 3-inch screen. Like I think if Jesus comes back and starts telling everyone everything, everybody's just gonna be twittering and they won't be like, I am Christ and I have returned. Oh my God, Jesus is right in front of me right now. I swear to God.
It's so accurate though, right? I mean, it's essentially everything that we do now is kind of mediated through these devices, which if you take it to the next level, I think this is where the future is going to be. So Google had already had Google Glasses that was taken down just by public outrage because people thought it was creepy. But there's companies like Samsung working on these contact lenses, right? And the moment that you have these contact lenses, first of all, you capture everything that you do, everywhere that you go, and you also now have a display where you can show hyper-personalized content in a way that is not accessible at all to other people, right? So my reality of the world might be completely different to yours. So if we're worried about people being put into echo chambers, we should definitely be on the lookout for this. And then take it a step further, Elon Musk's dream of putting chips into everybody's brain, that gives you direct access to the source, right? And that might be a little bit further into the future, but it's certainly possible technologically. So now, coming back to this read and write, we can read directly from the source, and we can also directly write into the source. Final one, what now? Now, I think there's a lot of talk, and I'm happy to continue this conversation in the Q&A, but there's a lot of talk and like more progressive data protection regulations like the GDPR in Europe, which heavily focus on control. Right, so the idea that privacy isn't really about secrecy. It's not about you not putting anything out there. It's really about you having control over your data and what is being done with it. So this notion of transparency and control is really guiding a lot of these regulations. Now, I think it's a great idea, and I'm all for giving people control, but my argument is that it's not enough. And the reason, or the way that I think about this is, it's essentially kind of putting you in charge of your own sailing boat, right? Being the captain of your own sailing boat is amazing when you're in the Mediterranean Sea. There's only really nice places that you can go to, and it's just beautiful. But that's not, and also this is generated by AI, which makes me a little bit feel better about myself, right? Because the leg is totally through the wheel. So there's certain things that AI still can't figure out that we have a very easy time with. So that made me feel much better yesterday. But again, so it's really nice if you had all the knowledge in the world of what can be done with your data and all the time in the world to really figure out, well, is this a good use of my data? Should I be kind of subscribing to these terms and conditions? Should I be accepting these cookies? Great, but that's not the world that we live in. The world that we live in is there's a gazillion emergencies at the same time. You can only make bad decisions, right? Because people are trying to push you towards sharing more and more and more. And in that world, my argument is that essentially having more control isn't necessarily a right, but it very quickly becomes a burden, right? Instead of saying, well, we put the onus on companies to better protect your data, we're just putting the onus on you, and now good luck, right? I study this, like I've been studying this for 10 years, and I have a hard time keeping track. And it's even if I wanted to keep track, I don't want to spend 24/7 on just that, right? I have better things to do. I have a family, I have work that I love. I don't want to read the terms and conditions of every single service. So I think what we need to do, and the way that I've been thinking about this in the context of this metaphor is one thing is we need to try and tame the sea, and for me that is regulation. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but you can imagine taxing personal data. You could imagine trying to make sure that not one company is getting too powerful. The one thing that I briefly want to mention is the second part, which I think in a way gives us a lot more agency and is also a promising solution that not that many people talk about. And that's like what I think of as like giving you a competent crew, right? If you're in a raging thunderstorm, you don't want to be by yourself. You want to be surrounded by experts who know what they're doing and they know how to sail the boat to safe harbor. And for that, let me quickly return to Fergusheim, the village that we started with. Because back in the day, so my family owned some of these vineyards, and it was like a very small part. And at some point, I had a friend visiting from Japan, and we just walking through the vineyards. And his question to me was like, oh, can I taste your wine? And I just had to laugh because we're not producing wine, right? We had like a tiny patch of land with a few vineyards. We had no idea of how to make wine. But it was a good question. The question was like, what actually happens to the grapes? And what happens in these regions is that there's a lot of families who own these small patches of lands, vineyards, and none of them know how to make wine. So what we have is these wine co-ops. So it's essentially families coming together. We're all pooling the grapes. And that gives us a lot more power, right? If we now want to go to a winemaker and say, hey, we're going to sell you the grapes that we make, we can ask for a lot more money because it's not just us with like a barrel of grapes, but it's like the entire community that can sell the grapes together. You can also have wine co-ops where actually you kind of hire expertise. So you hire management that is put in place to turn these grapes that we produce into something that it tastes pretty decent. It's not your Chianti or so, but it's not too bad either. You can imagine doing the same thing with data, right? So instead of pooling your grapes, you could have people who share an interest in data. And the example that's top of mind for me is expecting mothers, because I just had a baby in January. While you're pregnant, you want to know exactly at any given point in time, what should I be doing to make sure that I'm healthy and that the baby's healthy? And for that, it would be amazing to have a pool of data of like genetics, medical histories, biometrics, Fitbit data of like other expecting mothers, right? Because then you can really figure out, well, what's given your context, given your history, given the environment, what is it that you should be worried about, and what is it that you should be doing? And I don't necessarily trust pharma companies to handle all of that data, right? Genetic data is super intimate. But you could imagine that we could come together in what we call a data co-op, share this data, and now have management who actually is trying to act in our best interest with fiduciary responsibilities, the same way that we have this in the financial context, and is now trying to help us make the most of the data that we generate. So again, I think this is an idea that even in an environment that's pretty hostile, you can actually leverage your data to your own benefit without having it be this burden that most people, I think, cannot really handle. Okay, and with that, we're transitioning to the Q&A. Thank you so much. I kind of try to summarize all of this in a book that's coming out in January 2025, so it's still a while. But if you're interested, stay tuned. Thank you so much. Okay, questions. I think you had a question. There's 2 microphones. Thank you so much. Yeah. It's coming.
Oh, thank you. Oh, I work in 3 creative fields. I also study and research creativity, and it's been now proven by many studies that creativity makes people happier performing it, and I'm worried about what's going to happen when they don't have a chance or an opportunity for creativity, or whatever they studied for 20 years is being done by some bot. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I love this question. So it's a great starting question. You can sometimes trigger me. So it's if sometimes you ask a question, I could go on for hours. So you just have to cut me short at some point. But I think it's such an interesting question. And one of the things because it's usually this comparison between man versus machine, right? So it's like, who is more creative? And one of the things that, first of all, I think when we're talking about art and we're talking about creativity, it's oftentimes not just the outcome, right? So we can look at the painting and we say, well, this looks nice or it doesn't look nice. But what we're really buying when we buy art is the story behind it. It's like the story of an artist who had to go through all of these hardships, or like the story that kind of went into creating this painting. And that's something that AI can't replace, right? If the question is, like, can AI replace all of the creativity, or is there room for something that's uniquely human about creativity? I think that's part of the story, is like, human creativity adds a story, and it adds like this personal touch that we don't necessarily get with creativity. The other point. So here's the second part of this question. Like one of the things that we know, and this was I'm not sure if the study is already published, but it's like done by one of my friends and colleagues, is like what they looked at is the extent to which creativity increases, human creativity increases if they work jointly with AI. So in this case, they looked at writers, and they said, well, there's a group that is just like writing their own stories, and there's a group that gets ideas from AI, and now let's see which stories are actually judged as being more creative by outsiders, right? So both groups write a story, and now we have other people say how creative those stories are. What you see is that on average, humans working with AI is actually perceived as more creative, and they also kind of potentially enjoy this process more, because oftentimes you just need to have like this, right? Like if I start writing and there's a blank page, it's very difficult. Once you have like a few ideas, you can build on. That's what the brain is really good at. However, so on average, those ideas are more creative if they're created conjointly. Now the downside is, and I think that's the question between individual and collective, is the downside is they also become a lot more similar. So now, like the collective creativity is actually collapsing because the models essentially make the same suggestions or similar suggestions all the time. And I think that's a big question of like, well, I can individually become more creative, but then what's the collective damage that we're doing to creativity? Okay, and I'm going to stop there. So if up here and then here. Oh, sorry, here.
Professor, thank you for your inspiring lecture. You touched on therapy earlier. As you know, mental illness is an epidemic in the United States, and apps have made counseling service or democratized counseling service in the United States and probably other countries of the world. But very often, people keep switching the counselor from one to another because due to the poor counseling service they received. I can imagine that there's a good use case for applying AI, for example, predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics to augment the counseling service provided by a human being. So
100%.
that clients can get higher quality of service, especially there has been an increase in suicidal attempts. If predictive analytics can be applied, the counselor knows ahead of time, oh, this person has a higher propensity to commit a suicide, then she can proactively provide prescriptive solutions by utilizing prescriptive analytics.
100%. And I mean, if you look at the numbers are really grim in this space, right? So every 40 seconds around the world, someone commits suicide successfully. And for that, there's like 9 additional attempts for each suicide. So there's like this huge, as you say, endemic of like people having a hard time. Now, one of the things that I love that you mentioned is that I don't think about this as a standalone, right? So you have all of these apps that provide therapy, and it's just like you interact with the app, and that's come a long way, I should say. So those apps existed a couple of years ago, and they were pretty basic, right? So it was like a decision tree. If the person says this, you respond in this way. They made horrendous mistakes. So sometimes, like, I just remember those examples where someone says, I want to kill myself and I want to jump off a bridge, and it just recommends the closest bridge to that person. So that's really what you don't want to see. That I think we fixed by now. So I think like AI with, again, generative AI has become a lot better. But for me, the interesting part, and that's actually some of my friends at Stanford are working on this, which is what AI is incredibly good at, is helping therapists become better and helping train therapists in a much more accessible and affordable way. So what AI can do is it can essentially play the role of like a digital client, right, or digital kind of patient, and a digital supervisor. So as a therapist, you now go in, you start having a conversation, you kind of open your session on PTSD, and you kind of make the introduction with your client. The digital agent can respond as if it was a client, but now you also have the supervisor on top, which is also an AI, who's telling you, okay, based on the DSM-5 instruction manual, based on what we know about how to treat PTSD effectively, here's actually what you should have done, or here's how you could optimize your approach. And I think that is like a really promising. That's like using AI to make humans better, and to make humans better at scale, where not everybody can afford to go to Columbia and get like a therapy license. Yeah. Oh, okay. You're managing the microphones. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. First question: can we get the AI that made that trailer to make that movie?
To make that, yeah.
And now for the real question. So you mentioned, I thought it was really surprising that AI knows people than even the closest people in their lives. So I'm wondering, at what point do you think AI might know a person more than the person might know about themselves? Because each individual has their own, and we talk about this in business school, like their own hidden strengths and hidden weaknesses. And if AI is able to look at our digital life and help us become more self-aware to reach like self-realization, I think that could be pretty powerful. And if there's any tools you recommend, if that's currently being explored. Thank you.
It's a great question. So there's 2 answers to this. One is that we already see this a little bit. So one of the things that we can do is essentially, so let's say I have people's self-reported personality traits and I have their predicted personality traits. Now they don't perfectly overlap, but what we can do is we can use both to predict other stuff, right? So let's say I predict whether you're extroverted, introverted, open-minded, more conservative, and we predict which profession you're going to choose, whether you might suffer from mental health issues. And what we see is that oftentimes, even though AI can't fully predict how you describe yourself, it's sometimes just as good or even better at predicting some of these other outcomes, which means that it must be picking up on something that you don't have access to, right? Or at least that you don't want to admit to in that moment. It could be because it's social media. It could be that like some of your spending is not just for yourself, but others. But there is at least something in the AI that makes predictions of what's happening in your life better than your self-reports do. And I think that's, in a way, it's a question of what do you do with it, right? So do you give yourself access to, like, let's say an AI that you kind of define the goal and you say, here's what I want to do. Now, can you coach me and can you try to get me to do that with the example of savings? One of the concerns that I still have in this context, and I mean, there's a lot of talk of like personal AI, personal assistants, is that if the only thing that we're optimizing for is just understanding us better and putting us like in this certain box and trying to optimize around that box, is we're just going to become so boring, right? So part of the human experience is that you make mistakes, you accidentally take a right turn, and then you find a coffee shop that's actually even more amazing than the one that you typically go to. Like once everything is optimized with the same algorithms, what you would have to do, and we talk about this actually in the context of business schools sometimes with culture, because culture can be very cliquey unless you make diversity part of the culture. And the same is true for algorithms, right? So you could have an algorithm where you say, most of the time, optimize for this goal, optimize for my pleasure and engagement and enjoyment. But actually, I want to have the option to say, today, I want an explorer mode. Today, I want to see something that's totally different. And to me, that's not just like a fun gadget. It's actually an incredible opportunity if you think about this, right? Because we only ever have one perspective on the world. And that's our own, because that's kind of what we experience. It's very hard for me to say, well, what's the experience of like someone who's 55 years old, lives in Ohio, and has like a completely different political take than me. Now, actually, those recommendation engines that exist within Google, within Facebook, could give us that, right? So I could just say to Google, well, show me what the search results look like, not just optimized for me, but optimized for someone of that specific demographic. And then I think we're becoming a lot closer to this notion of like, can we have AI just assist us in what we're trying to do? And it's not trying to always optimize for the same thing, but giving us a say in, do we want to exploit? Do we want to kind of see more of what we need? Or do we want to explore and get something new? I told you, like, you just need small triggers.
So my question actually, you preempted a bit of it, and two thoughts came to my mind. One is, when we mechanized a lot of the world, physical effort went out of our daily life a lot, and now we have to go to the gym to get the same thing done. Now with the language processing that we are putting in here, I have two thoughts that come to my mind. One is, this is a very static view. If you're looking at my last 300 likes, that's the way I was. But just like you said, I'm always constantly also exploring, and that interaction is shaping me. Now, I recently got an invite to attend an AI talk about how dating might end up with two bots. So I have a bot and other people have a bot, and they're talking to each other to figure out, are you a match?
Great for introverts.
Great for introverts, but great for static people.
Yeah.
Because during that interaction, you discover something about yourself. So I guess my question to you is, where do you see the equivalent of gym, where we give up more of the agency to this technology? How would people continue to evolve, to challenge and grow their thinking, to grow as human beings, so we don't end up in Matrix and just be like absorbing whatever the heck is being given to us?
I think there's actually two parts to this question. And it's funny that you bring up the physical world, because my husband and I, we started a center, and this is the last question, unfortunately, I was just told, that we call the Center for Advanced Technology and Human Performance. And the way that we started thinking about this is that we have all of these technologies that help us become better physically, right? So we can't run that fast, so we have cars and we have airplanes that get us around the world. We can't survive in extreme heat, extreme cold, so we have ACs and heating. But we don't typically have the same thing in the cognitive space, right? So we haven't developed that many technologies that actually help us overcome some of the cognitive limitations. And I think it's a double-edged sword, as you say. So to some extent, we can get a lot better, right? And there's constantly things that we fail at. and that are actually very detrimental. So that could be like eating more healthily, exercising more. Like there's a lot of stuff that actually is just a limitation of the brain that we could overcome. At the same time, it's also a question, what are we giving up on? So there's already a lot of research showing that if you post stuff on social media, for example, that you're more likely to forget about that. So you have a memory, you put it on social, and now because your brain has outsourced it, it's a memory that you don't remember as much. So that's something that I think we're actually giving up, which we might not be super, super happy about. And then the second part about like the dynamic nature of personality, 100%. So everything that I've shown you, so like in the beginning was essentially I just get your history and I make a very relatively static prediction, right? You're an extrovert or an introvert. I alluded to it a little bit with the shift to like smartphones and like all of these data points that are captured in the moment, which allow us to make much more dynamic predictions, right? And the way that personality psychologists think about this is it's not that you're just an extrovert with like a point estimate. You're kind of a distribution. So most of the time, maybe you're more extroverted, but then you spend some time in the library, and you're more introverted, you spend some time in the bar, and you're even more extroverted. Now, all of this situational and contextual information we can now capture with devices, right? We know exactly where you are. We can predict your mood based on your physical activity, based on facial expressions. And that gives it, or we could just look at the chat that you've just gone through, right? And all of that in the moment data allows us to very dynamically update our estimate of who you are in that point in time. So I'm sorry that we ran out of time, but thank you so much for coming. It's really nice to see you.